Okay, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is David Carl. I'm currently serving as Associate Dean of Graduate Studies here at the Santa Fe campus of St. John's College. And I'd like to welcome you to the final in the series of summer lectures, which are sponsored by the Graduate Institute every summer, Wednesday afternoons, starting in late June and running through the end of July. Today, I am very pleased to be able to welcome to our campus Professor Roller, who will be giving us a lecture on Cleopatra. Professor Roller's degree is from Harvard, where he studied classical archaeology and then spent a career teaching at Ohio State University before joining us here in Santa Fe 18 years ago. I was saying to Mr. Roller right before his lecture, I am particularly interested in today's talk because my wife is from Macedonia and is convinced that she is a descendant of Cleopatra. So I'm eager to hear more about my wife's ancestress. Professor Roller, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about a woman that we've probably all heard of, perhaps the most famous woman from classical antiquity. What have we heard about her? She was the Greek queen of Egypt, who was successively the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She lost her kingdom to the Romans because she could not control her hormones, and probably the most famous woman from classical antiquity. We can see her dramatized by Elizabeth Taylor or Claudette Colbert as Shakespeare's tragic heroine, the subject of art by Delacroix, Handel, Berlioz, and many others. In fact, since her death, her reputation seems to have transcended that of her real life. But what we're going to explore today is the real Cleopatra. Was she any of the above that I've said, or was she a victim not of her passions, but her later reputation? History, to paraphrase George Bernard Shaw, is written by the winners, and Cleopatra lost. The real Cleopatra is notoriously difficult to grasp. First, we have to forget everything that we've seen or heard about her in popular culture. But the actual sources for her are scattered and elusive. Even before her death in 30 BC, the Roman literary propaganda machine went to work against her. Horace called her the frenzied queen, mad and drunk with lust. Virgil in the Aeneid called her nothing more than the Egyptian mate of Antony. Thoughts such as these determine the reputation of Cleopatra forever. Contemporary documents from before her death are almost non-existent, and even then they're sanitized. Julius Caesar, in his report on conditions in Alexandria in the 40s BC, states that he restored her to the throne, but discreetly avoids mentioning any other contact with her. Cicero knew her but didn't like her. Even before she died, it was impossible to assess Cleopatra without bias. And the fact that she was a woman didn't help. 100 years after her death, the Greek scholar Plutarch, in his biography of Antony, wrote in detail about Cleopatra, our most complete source. Although Plutarch was also subject to the prejudices that canonized her as a dangerous threat to Rome, his grandfather knew people who had worked with Cleopatra, and through this source, Plutarch provided us with a rare eyewitness account of Cleopatra, which is not tangled into Roman political rhetoric. This is what Plutarch has to say. Her beauty, we are told, was not totally incomparable and did not really impress those who saw her, but conversation with her was irresistibly charming, and her presence, along with the persuasiveness of her discussion and her character, affected those around her and was particularly stimulating. Her voice was especially sweet, and she could easily make use of whatever language she wished. so that when she had discussions with barbarians, she hardly ever needed an interpreter, but answered most of them without assistance, whether they were Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabians, Syrians, Medes, or Parthians. It is said that she learned many other languages, although her predecessors as Egyptian kings had not even bothered to learn the local language. This is the real Cleopatra, perhaps the only honest surviving account of the queen. And we have up here visually probably the best portrait of Cleopatra, although I should emphasize the identification is based on art historical iconography, not any labeling or anything like that. It's a portrait in Berlin, and it's perhaps a good, if not idealized, example of what she looked like. Coins also give us an indication of what she looked like. Coins have the advantage of being truly contemporary. They can be dated. But at the same time, coins are not always of the highest artistic quality. In antiquity, you tended to make coins on the spot. You'd get a hoard of gold from the barbarians and turn it into coinage. But you might not have had an expert die maker with you. So coins can be pretty lousy. But nevertheless, this is one of the few portraits we have of Cleopatra that we know was actually made from life. And here's another coin of somewhat higher quality, but again, we know that it was made from life, and this perhaps says some indication of what she might have looked like. She's wearing the royal diadem. In some of these coins, you can't really see it here because it's not in great shape. She's wearing earrings. In some of them, she's wearing a necklace. So we have some indication of what she looked like, but it still is something fraught with difficulty. So, how did this talented woman end up being Queen of Egypt, the last major independent Greek ruler to fall to the Romans? To understand this, we have to go back to the year 323 BC and the death of Alexander the Great. Alexander died in Babylon after returning from his epic journey to India. All along the route, he had founded cities that he named after himself, including one in Egypt at the western mouth of the Nile, the most famous of the many Alexandrias, and the only one that has survived today as a major modern city. But when Alexander died at the age of 33, he left no instructions about what to do with the vast territories he had acquired. Squabbling immediately broke out between his companions and relatives, creating a long and convoluted process that lasted for the next 40 years. Of interest to us is one of his companions, a certain Ptolemy, a childhood friend of the king's, who, in the midst of the infighting, pulled off a major coup. He hijacked Alexander's body. Remember, Alexander died in Babylon. And he took it to Egypt, to the new city of Alexandria, where Ptolemy was already royal governor. His possession of the body, soon to be enshrined in a great tomb in Alexandria, gave him immense status, unequaled by any of the other companions of Alexander. By 305, he was calling himself King of Egypt, and he created a Greek kingdom in Egypt that was to last for the next 275 years. Although, unlike his famous descendant, he never bothered to learn the Egyptian language. And Cleopatra was his direct descendant, his great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. So, we pass through the generations, Ptolemy succeeding Ptolemy as king, until we come to the 12th of that name, who came to the throne in 80 BC. He had 4 children, our Cleopatra, 2 boys, both named Ptolemy, who are noted as Ptolemy 13 and 14, and another girl named Arsinoe. The children did not get along together, and their father began seriously to worry about the royal succession. He used his contacts in Rome to have the most senior Roman, Pompey the Great, named as their guardian. In early 51, Ptolemy XII died. Two of the children, Cleopatra and the older boy, Ptolemy XIII, became joint rulers and legally at least husband and wife. I say legally because Ptolemy XIII was only 11 years old. But this is a political matter, not a personal one. But the father's worries were well-founded, because within a few months Cleopatra expelled her brother, and this 18-year-old queen is now showing that she's the one who's going to take control. For the next 2 years, the rulers fought back and forth, each expelling the other from Alexandria. Cleopatra's position gradually weakened as her brother gained the upper hand and she was forced to take refuge in Syria. Meanwhile, things were happening in Rome. Now we're talking about the 40s BC, basically. Pompey was now virtual sole ruler and marginalized his opponents, most importantly, the dynamic Julius Caesar. He banished Julius Caesar to a lengthy provincial post in Gaul. But in early 49 BC, Caesar suddenly and unexpectedly returned to Rome, crossing the Rubicon River, and Pompey fled to Greece, where he was militarily defeated. Remembering his role as guardian of the Egyptian dynasty, he sought sanctuary there, only to be killed by a faction opposing Roman intervention in Egyptian affairs as he stepped from his ship. Caesar arrived a few days later on the track of Pompey. Caesar immediately undertook Pompey's role to bring an end to the quarreling rulers, but battles continued, and sometime during this period, and we're in the summer of 48 BC, Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers. This is the famous incident in which she was wrapped up in a bed cover and carried into Caesar's presence. So two of the most dynamic people of the era had met on both political and personal terms. Needless to say, before long, Caesar, no surprise, was favoring Cleopatra over her brother. And soon Ptolemy XIII was killed in one of the frequent battles. So by the beginning of 47, Cleopatra was sole ruler of Egypt. It is at this point that we begin to get into trouble in trying to understand Cleopatra. We all know that people smitten with one another may make errors of judgment. But at the same time, we have to remember that Caesar and Cleopatra were hardly ordinary people. Both were, legally at least, for a while, married to others. Both were powerful personalities whose political situation was severely threatened. The death of Pompey had not ended the civil war at Rome, as it was to continue for another 18 years. And Cleopatra's short reign had been marked by more time in exile than actually ruling. Certainly there was a genuine personal attachment between Caesar and Cleopatra, and both were people noted for their charm and charisma. But it's a mistake to see the relationship as purely hormonal. Personal liaisons between Greek and Roman people of power were not for personal reasons. They were a source of power. Cleopatra especially knew exactly what she was doing. She was giving support to her weak rule by allying herself with the most powerful living Roman, trying to assure her survival as queen. Nevertheless, Caesar may have overstepped the bounds of public propriety, and his relationship with Cleopatra was a factor in his assassination 3 years later. But for the time being, he acted cautiously. And when he proclaimed Cleopatra queen at the beginning of 47, he also named her surviving younger brother, the 14th Ptolemy, as joint ruler. And Ptolemy the 14th disappears from the record shortly thereafter. Caesar and Cleopatra spent the autumn, winter, and spring of 48-47 living together, something that did not win approval in either Egypt or Rome. This was the time of their famous trip up the Nile. Cleopatra may have miscalculated in becoming so dependent on Caesar, whose position was supported by 3 legions. Caesar was virtual governor of a virtual Roman province, seen in Rome as an adulterer, and in Egypt as an unwanted de facto king. Moreover, it was obvious by early 47 that Cleopatra was pregnant. In April 47, Caesar returned to Rome and his wife. 2 months later, on the 23rd of June, Cleopatra's child was born, who was given the name Ptolemy the 15th Caesar. You can't see it very well, but she's holding a child in this coin. And what is perhaps more relevant here is this relief from the Temple of Dindur in Egypt, in which Cleopatra on the extreme right, her son in front of her, are being presented to Isis. Now, the interesting thing is that when this was done, the son was still a baby. But it's a bit of political propaganda to show he is going to grow up and be the next ruler of Egypt. The child was named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Was he Caesar's child? Probably. Although Caesar was quite diffident about the matter, it didn't play well in Rome because of his legal marriage, which was childless. In Egypt, Caesarion was certainly regarded as Caesar's child, but allegedly Caesar denied paternity to the end of his life. The evidence is mixed, but probably. The 3 legions that Caesar had left in Egypt ensured the immediate peace and prosperity of Cleopatra's kingdom. But a year later, summer 46, Caesar invited the queen and her brother, Ptolemy XIV, to Rome and established them in one of his villas across the Tiber. The 2 were officially recognized as rulers, allied and friendly to the Roman people. This is a legal term, confirming their status. But the presence of Cleopatra in Rome didn't go over well with a lot of people. Cicero, whose surviving letters are a rare contemporary account of the period, showed his distaste, never mentioning her by name, but just saying, well, that queen's at it again. Caesar's legal wife, Calpurnia, came from one of the most distinguished families in Rome. She was childless and was very quickly seen as a victim. Opposition to Caesar mounted for many reasons. And when the assassins led by Brutus and Cassius struck on the Ides of March of 44, Cleopatra, or at least her continued residency in Rome, was certainly a factor. Yet even after Caesar's death, she stayed in Rome seeking legal support for Caesarion as her successor, but left after a month, having failed to achieve this. Within Egypt, however, she declared Caesarion her heir apparent and strengthened his and her position by, this time, eliminating her brother Ptolemy XIV. For the next few years, she settled down to rule as queen. Times were difficult in Egypt. Her father had seriously diminished Egyptian resources and lavish expenditures, and there were repeated famines and plagues. It was a period like over 1,000 years previously described in the book of Exodus. The Nile was at a historic low. Cleopatra moved swiftly to assess the situation, dispensing royal resources, especially the grain stockpiles, to the people. It probably is at this time that Plutarch's reference to her receiving ambassadors from all over the Eastern Mediterranean and speaking to them in their own language refers. Ptolemaic Egypt was not the power that it had been 2 centuries previously, but its reach still extended far up the Nile. We can go back to the map here if I can find it. So its reach extended far up the Nile. It extended west into North Africa and included Cyprus and much of the very eastern Mediterranean into Asia Minor. Cleopatra stabilized the situation and began to restore Egypt to its former prosperity. Yet things were not quiet in Rome. Caesar's murder had not brought an expected end to the civil war, and new factions were forming. At his death, Caesar's principal colleague, remember the Romans had 2 consuls who were the heads of state. Caesar was one consul, and the surviving consul was another familiar name from the era, Mark Antony. He had been to Egypt on official business a few years previously, so he and Cleopatra had already met. And Mark Antony expected to be Caesar's successor, both politically and personally. But Caesar, in his will, left his powers to his little-known grandnephew, Octavian, and in the process managed to offend everybody, especially his alleged son Caesarion and Antony. But Antony and Octavian moved swiftly to dispose of Caesar's murderers. Cleopatra had sought to become involved in this, sending her fleet to Alexandria, which she commanded herself. But circumstances conspired to marginalize her role, and she was not present when Brutus and Cassius were defeated at Philippi in the autumn of 42. Philippi is not on the map, but it's up where it says the A is the final A in Macedonia. After Philippi, Octavian returned west while Antony remained in the east to ensure there was no residual support for the assassins. It was a peculiar twist of fate that he was chosen for this role. One of those things that if it hadn't happened, the history of the world would have been different. As noted, he'd already met Cleopatra 13 years previously, and one immediately wonders what his motive was in summoning her to his headquarters at the ancient city of Tarsus, which is in southern Asia Minor. Again, we come to another famous incident in Cleopatra's life, described by Plutarch and obtained from an eyewitness source. She sailed up the Kidnus River in a boat with a golden stern, purple sails spread, the rowers pulling the silver oars to the sound of flute, pipes, and string. She herself reclined under a canopy adorned with gold, looking like a painting of Aphrodite, with boys like cupids in paintings standing on either side and fanning her. In addition, her most beautiful serving maidens were positioned, like Nereids or Graces, at the tiller and the lines. Marvelous scents from innumerable incense offerings spread along the riverbank. It was said everywhere that Aphrodite had come to celebrate with Dionysus for the good of Asia. And the key that this is probably an eyewitness account is the reference to the marvelous scents. So, she invited Antony for dinner on board, and it quickly turned into something more. Again, we must remember that Cleopatra was making a political statement in seducing Antony. She needed him politically. Caesar was gone. Her position in Egypt was precarious. She'd failed to win legal status for her only child. And she still had a surviving sister who's kind of been out of the story for a while. She's been in exile in Ephesus. But there were people who thought that the sister Arsinoe was the legal queen of Egypt. Like Caesar had been, Antony was now the most powerful Roman alive. Octavian, although Caesar's heir, was young and untested and could easily be dismissed. Antony could be of great use to Cleopatra in consolidating her kingdom and restoring Ptolemaic glory, perhaps even expanding her territories in farther west in North Africa, farther north into the Levant and Asia Minor, areas that the Ptolemies had had a claim to from one time or another. Dynastic survival was always a priority of ancient royalty, and Cleopatra was 28 and had no legal heir. Assuring an heir was far more difficult for a woman than a man because of the biological realities. And seducing Antony also helped on this front. He came to Egypt for the winter of 41-40, much as Caesar had a few years previously, and the two lived a lavish life, about which there are many anecdotes, some of which may be true. An indisputable fact is that in the summer of 40, Cleopatra gave birth to twins fathered by Antony, whom she named Alexander and Cleopatra. The message is not very subtle here. The wonderful days of Alexander the Great would soon return, and little Cleopatra, surnamed Selene, the moon, would carry on her mother's image. Antony, in a division he and Octavian had made after the death of Caesar, was the head Roman magistrate for the Eastern Mediterranean. And he began to use his powers to favor Cleopatra, steadily giving territory to her at Roman expense. This didn't go over well in Rome, obviously. He also eliminated the sole surviving sister, Arsinoe, and before long the Ptolemaic Empire was indeed being reconstituted. But the year of 40 BC saw two peculiar twists. First, Antony returned to Rome and married Octavian's sister, Octavia, making it appear that his dalliance with Cleopatra had little significance beyond the pleasures of a soldier on campaign. Second, Cleopatra found a new rival, not a personal but a political one. In 40 BC, a dynamic young king came to the throne in Judea, Herod the Great of biblical fame, whom the Romans placed on the throne in 40 and whose territorial ambitions clashed with those of Cleopatra in the Eastern Mediterranean. Antony returned to the east in 37. The Romans were having difficulty with the Parthians, who ruled on the Iranian plateau. They're marked at the eastern edge of the map. And repeatedly they threatened the Eastern Mediterranean. Antony was sent to make war on them as the final step in securing the East. If the Parthian threat could be eliminated, the Eastern Mediterranean would either be Roman territory or that of its two prominent vassal royalty, Cleopatra and Herod. In the autumn of 37, Antony set up his headquarters near Antioch at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean. Soon Cleopatra joined him. And it's at this point things change and Antony's motives become inscrutable, and we have very great difficulty in figuring out just what the guy was up to. He became more dependent on her and less on Rome. In fact, he was never to return to Rome. The Parthian campaign seemed momentarily forgotten as the two resumed their luxurious way of life. Antony acknowledged the paternity of the twins, now 3 years old, and soon a third child was born with his own politically significant name, Ptolemy. So we have Alexander, Cleopatra, Ptolemy, and Caesarion, the four children of Cleopatra. Despite the emphasis in the sources on the lifestyle of Antony and Cleopatra, he was hard at work reorganizing the East, whether for himself, Cleopatra, or Rome. It's hard to figure out. The details really don't concern us, but the effect was to give more power to Cleopatra, restoring the Egyptian kingdom to its former glory. Whether he was planning to be its king, as the Romans claimed, is unclear. Cleopatra even brought Herod, still a young, energetic ruler, and not betraying the madness that would taint his later career, on board. She offered Herod the post of her chief of military staff. He was too smart to accept this. The sources say she attempted to seduce him, unlikely, but Herod, who is as wily as Cleopatra in his own way, went an independent line. Gradually, the Eastern Mediterranean took shape as a region dominated by Cleopatra, with Herod now her vassal, rather than a vassal of Rome, and Roman territory severely diminished in favor of Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra even struck coinage together. Greek coins with both their portraits were minted in many cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. The line between Roman magistrate, which Antony legally was, and his relationship to the Egyptian queen was now blurred. They were speaking with one voice. Such activities did not win favor in Rome, where Octavian had consolidated his power and Antony was still married to Octavian's sister. Finally, the Parthian campaign set forth in 36. We must remember that this is why he's in the East in the first place. Preparations had been ongoing for a year, but the campaign ended in disaster. Tens of thousands were killed. Antony was betrayed by his guides. As often happened with people from the Mediterranean, he was unprepared for the harsh winters of the high country. And so he retreated back to Antioch. Cleopatra was in charge of the relief and the evacuation, and the two ended up together again in Alexandria. Antony's reputation in Rome was sinking fast, and when his wife Octavia offered to finance a repeat campaign, she was rebuffed. Octavian saw this as an insult to his sister, who was highly popular in Rome, and began to engage a propaganda machine that sought to depict Antony as a captive of a Greek seductress. It was becoming apparent that Antony could never return to Rome, and in fact, he spent the rest of his life with Cleopatra. In the spring of 34, there was a great ceremony in the gymnasium of Alexandria. This confirmed the ruling couple's vision of the future. All of Cleopatra's siblings were conveniently dead and had left no heirs, so there were no rivals. Cleopatra received the title Queen of Egypt, Queen of Kings. 13-year-old Caesarion became King of Kings and was put forth as the only legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, a direct insult to Octavian. The younger children are given territory. Cleopatra Selene Libya, little Ptolemy Syria and Phoenicia. Forthcoming royal marriages were arranged for all the children. At least as Antony and Cleopatra saw it, the Eastern Mediterranean, from southern Asia Minor around to central North Africa, was now theirs, with a network of alliances and marriage prospects that would ensure dynastic survival. The only exception was the territories of their loyal ally Herod, although Cleopatra continued vainly to covet his land. These events only intensified the propaganda war emanating from Rome. Octavian, using the treatment of his sister Octavia as a precedent, skillfully turned public opinion against Antony. And the giving away of Roman territory also rankled, even though This was legally, if unwise, within Antony's power as a Roman magistrate. It was really impolitic to do so. Favoring Caesarion was a personal offense to Octavian, since Octavian had put himself forth as Caesar's true and legal heir and owed much of his power and position to that fact. The straight-laced Romans were still suspicious enough of Greeks and the indulgent lifestyle of Eastern royalty that it was particularly disagreeable to see a Roman magistrate undertaking that role. Throughout 33, dueling communiques emanated from Roman Alexandria, each side accusing the other of impropriety. Octavian emphasized Antony's adultery and dispensing of Roman territory and his lavish Eastern lifestyle. Antony and Cleopatra in turn questioned Octavian's very legitimacy as the heir of Caesar, suggesting that they were the future of Rome and were prepared to transform Rome into a Greek monarchy of immense strength and wealth. An oracle even appeared that suggested that Cleopatra was the Messiah who would liberate the Eastern Mediterranean from Roman control. At the end of 33, Antony's magisterial term expired. This meant he no longer had any legal position in Rome, and thus he became totally dependent on Cleopatra. Octavian began to attack him openly in the Senate, especially since both Antony and Cleopatra continued to travel around the Eastern Mediterranean together and supply the Roman armies in this region, including their continued loyalty to them rather than to the Roman government. Octavian began to identify Cleopatra as the true enemy of Rome. It must be remembered that Antony was still his brother-in-law, so it could easily be argued that Cleopatra had seduced Antony both physically and mentally into betraying his obligations as a Roman. Antony and Cleopatra moved from Ephesus to Samos to Athens, all famous and distinguished Greek cities now under Roman control, demonstrating they were the true rulers of the East and marginalizing the Roman presence. Lavish living continued to be the rule, although probably exaggerated by the Roman propaganda machine. Yet there were stories of dinner parties where pearls were dissolved in vinegar and guests were given the gold and silver service as gifts. But the couple was enthusiastically welcomed wherever they went. Their benign monarchy was more compatible to the history of the region rather than the new Roman ways, for it had the validation of Alexander the Great and his successors. There was little opposition to their presence except for what was coming out of Rome. Cleopatra's financial resources were immense. The Ptolemies at their poorest were richer than the Romans at their richest, and this financed their activities and kept the armies loyal. In the late spring of 32, Cleopatra finally convinced Antony to send Octavia a letter of divorce, cutting off his last significant tie with Rome. This, of course, gave Octavian exactly what he needed. He saw it as an insult to his family and tantamount to a declaration of war. Octavian gained possession of Antony's will on file in Rome and staged a public reading of it. In Rome, a will was as much a political statement as a personal testament, and Antony's will said everything Octavian would have wished it to say, so much so that forgery has long been suspected, but unlikely. Antony stressed that Caesarion was the true heir of Julius Caesar, and he expressed his desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, even to have his body removed there if he were to die in Rome. This caused great public outcry in Rome, and it began to be rumored that Alexandria was slated to be the new capital of a Roman Empire. The propaganda machine began to intensify, and words like dangerous, monster, calamitous, ruinous were used to describe Cleopatra. She was said to have practiced witchcraft on Antony, causing him to betray his Roman heritage. what had begun as a family quarrel had evolved into an ideological struggle for the survival of Rome, which by late 32 became a fight for the future of the Eastern Mediterranean between Rome and the Ptolemaic kingdom. But it is clear that Cleopatra was by no means the irrational monster Rome presented her as. She made no attempt to attack Rome or to move very far from her territories. In fact, the survival and defense of her kingdom was her only issue, and she probably believed that Rome would not move so far as to attack her directly, her one fatal miscalculation. Nevertheless, Antony and Cleopatra sent their fleet to the west coast of Greece, where they could reconnoiter a possible Roman move to the east. The summer of 31 was spent in a naval blockade, with Roman forces unable to move out of southern Italy and northwest Greece. But soon the Romans gained the upper hand, for the supply lines available to the couple began to fail as the stalemate lasted through summer. On the 2nd of September at 31, an engagement took place at Actium, a promontory on the west coast of Greece. Octavian had spies within Antony's command, and the battle was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra, worried about the defense of Egypt, rushed back to Alexandria, and Antony followed her a few days later. The Eastern coalition that the two had built up quickly collapsed. Most notably, Herod the Great declared his loyalty to Octavian, which gave Octavian a potential base on the frontier of Egypt and cut it off from the rest of Western Asia and Asia Minor. Cleopatra, realizing that the Romans would attack Egypt, prepared to flee by building a fleet on the Red Sea, perhaps hoping to reach Arabia or India. But the Arabians, who had lost territory in Antony's rearrangement, burned the ships. Cleopatra also opened up negotiations with Octavian, asking that the kingdom be handed over to Caesarion and she would go into exile. This, of course, was impossible because of Antony's careful promotion of Caesarion as the one true heir of Caesar. By the spring of 30, Octavian's armies had landed in Egypt. Antony took an army out to meet him, which promptly revolted and went over to Octavian's side. It was said this was the work of Cleopatra, who now found Antony a liability and was still hoping for favorable terms from Octavian. On the 1st of August in 30, Octavian entered Alexandria. This is the official date that the Ptolemaic kingdom legally came to an end. The tale now has romantic overtones, but there is no reason to doubt what happened next. Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum and sent word to Antony that she was dead. Her motives are unclear, but perhaps she hoped this would allow Octavian to capture Antony, dispose of him, and return to Rome. Antony, however, bungled a suicide attempt and was brought to Cleopatra, hoisted up in her tomb to die in her arms at the age of 52. The sources imply that she was generally distraught at the turn of events. Octavian allowed Cleopatra to bury Antony and leave the mausoleum to return to her palace. He wanted her to appear in the spectacle that he was planning for Rome, but she had no desire for this and attempted to starve herself to death. Octavian, who had taken custody of the children, threatened reprisals against him and so ended that plan. Negotiations between the two dragged over the next 10 days, but finally on the 10th of August, Cleopatra carefully arranged her own death. Again, it is one of the rare cases where we have an eyewitness account because her personal physician Olympus recorded the details in a treatise that he published. The story is a familiar one. She bathed and had a great banquet. She was brought a basket of figs by a man from the country. Her guards checked it and allowed it to pass. Cleopatra wrote a letter to Octavian in which she expressed the hope that her children would be well treated, still expecting that one of them would rule and that she would be buried alongside Antony. When Octavian received the letter, he realized what was happening and quickly went to the palace, but it was too late. She had locked herself in her quarters, and her guards did not know anything had happened, and Octavian found her dead. And so the story of Cleopatra comes to an end at that point, and Octavian becomes the ruler of Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra are buried we know not where, and the Ptolemies come to an end. The asp story seems, although famous, to have been a later creation and a later fiction. And again, we have a final eulogy of Cleopatra. By Horace. She sought to die a more noble death and had no womanly fear for the dagger's point, nor did she use her swift fleet to seek a remote shore. She dared to look with a serene face on her fallen palace and was courageous enough to handle the deadly ass, so that she could absorb the black venom within her body.